I lived on a quiet street in a suburb of Ohio back in the late 90s. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. All the houses looked the same, with well-kept lawns and swing sets in the backyards. I spent most of my summer days playing tag with the other kids on the block. We were all between the ages of 8 and 12. Life felt very safe back then. One of the moms on the street, Mrs. Gable, was what everyone called the neighborhood mom. She was always outside with a pitcher of lemonade. She had 3 kids of her own, and they were always the leaders of our games. Mrs. Gable was a soft-spoken and very kind woman. She always wore floral dresses and had a very calm way of speaking. My parents trusted her completely. Whenever they had to go to the store, they'd just leave me at her house. One day, a new girl moved onto the block. Her parents were carnival workers who traveled for most of the year. They were friends of a friend of Mrs. Gable. Since they couldn't take the girl on the road, they arranged for her to stay with Mrs. Gable. They paid her a good amount of money to look after her. The girl's name was Sylvia. Sylvia was quiet, but she seemed nice enough. For the first week, she played outside with us. We played hide and seek in the bushes and rode bikes until the streetlights came on. But after that first week, Sylvia stopped coming outside. I asked Mrs. Gable's oldest son, Toby, where she was. He just shrugged and said she was sickly and needed to stay in bed. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids get the flu all the time. I just went back to playing tag with Toby and the others. About a month later, I was playing in my backyard, which faced the side of Mrs. Gable's house. It was a very hot July afternoon. I had hopped over the small fence to grab a stray ball that had rolled near her basement window. As I leaned down, I heard something. It was a faint, muffled sound. It sounded like someone was trying to hum, but through a closed mouth. I stopped and listened. The sound turned into a very soft, rhythmic thumping against the glass. It wasn't loud. It was just steady. Then, I heard a small sob. It was definitely a girl's voice. It sounded weak, like she hadn't had water in a long time. I felt a little bit of a chill, even in the heat. I walked back to my house and told my mom. I told her I thought Sylvia was crying in the basement. My mom didn't even look up from her book. She told me that it was family business. She said Mrs. Gable was a saint for taking in a stranger's child and that I shouldn't be snooping around. A few days later, I saw Toby and some of the other neighborhood kids going into Mrs. Gable's house. They weren't carrying toys. They were carrying heavy wooden sticks and a roll of duct tape. They looked serious. Not like they were going to play a game. They looked like they were going to work. I followed them to the porch, but Mrs. Gable was standing there. She smiled at me, but her eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on my face. "We're having a private lesson today, honey," she said. Her voice was still sweet, but it felt heavy, like she was warning me without saying it. "Is Sylvia okay?" I asked. I remember feeling a knot in my stomach. Mrs. Gable leaned down, so her face was level with mine. She smelled like lavender and old grease. "Sylvia is learning how to be a good girl," she whispered, "and the other children are helping her learn." I went home and didn't tell anyone. I felt like if I said something, I would be the one needing a lesson. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood felt different. The other kids didn't want to play tag anymore. They spent all their time inside Mrs. Gable's house. When it had come out, they were just quiet. They wouldn't look me in the eye. They looked older, somehow. Like they had a secret that was rotting them from the inside. One night, I couldn't sleep. It was raining hard. My bedroom window was cracked open to let in the cool air. I heard the sound again. The muffled crying. It was coming from across the lawn. It wasn't just a sob anymore. It sounded like a desperate, gasping struggle for air. I got up and looked out the window. The light in Mrs. Gable's basement was on. I could see shadows moving against the small, dirt-streaked window. The shadows were small. They were the shapes of children. I saw one shadow raise a hand and bring it down hard. Over and over again. I saw Mrs. Gable's shadow standing in the corner. She wasn't stopping them. She was pointing, as if she was directing them. I pulled my covers over my head and stayed there until morning. I told myself it was a dream. I had to believe it was a dream. The next morning, the street was filled with police cars. There were no sirens, just flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I stood on my porch and watched as they carried something out of the house. It was wrapped in a dirty gray tarp. It was very small. Mrs. Gable was walked out in handcuffs. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even screaming. She just looked bored. Behind her, the police let out Toby and the other neighborhood kids. They were all covered in dirt and something dark. They looked like they were in a trance. My mom was standing next to me, shaking. She kept saying she didn't know. She kept saying she thought it was just discipline. The news later that week was worse than anything I could have imagined. They found that Sylvia had been kept in a crawl space under the basement floor. She had been there for months. And the worst part wasn't just what Mrs. Gable had done. It was what she had made the other kids do. She had turned the neighborhood children into her own personal guards. She told them Sylvia was a demon. She told them that hurting her was a game that would keep their own family safe. Then I realized that I had been invited to those lessons. If I had gone inside that day, I might have been one of the ones holding the sticks. I saw Toby's face in the back of a police car as they drove him away. He didn't look like a kid who had been forced. He looked like he had enjoyed the power. The carnival workers never came back for the body. Sylvia was buried in a plain grave at the edge of town. Mrs. Gable's house sat empty for years. No one wanted to buy it. Eventually, the city tore it down, but the grass there never grew back right. It stayed brown and patchy, like the soil was poisoned by what happened under the floorboards. I moved away from Ohio years ago, but I still see those kids' faces in my dreams. I see them standing in a circle in that dark basement. I think about the fact that I was only 30 feet away. I heard her. I heard her every night for weeks, and I did nothing because I was told to mind my own business. I live with that silence every single day. The other kids from the block are mostly at a juvenile home now. They are adults walking around with normal lives. I sometimes wonder if they ever think about Sylvia, or if they are just waiting for someone else to tell them it's time for another lesson. Now, whenever I hear a muffled sound through a wall, I start to shake because I know that the person living next door could be a monster and the rest of the world will just call it family business. The realization that I let her die right under my nose is a constant, suffocating misery that I haven't recovered from. My grandfather was a very quiet man. He didn't have many hobbies besides woodworking and sitting on the porch. He would spend hours just staring at the tree line. I always thought he was just tired from a long life of manual labor. When I was 20, I had to help my parents clear out his attic. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The attic was hot and smelled like old dust and cedar. I found a lot of typical things. Old tools, black and white photos of people I didn't recognize. Then I found a box. It was tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets. Inside was a leather ledger. The edges were scorched black. The paper was brittle and felt like it would crumble if I breathed on it too hard. I sat on a trunk and started to read. Most of it was just numbers, logs of grain prices and hardware store receipts from 1927. But in the back, there was a handwritten entry. It wasn't written by a man. It was written by a child. The handwriting was shaky and hurried. My grandfather grew up in a small town in the Midwest. It was the kind of place where nobody locked their doors. Everyone went to the same church. Everyone knew everyone else's business. So it felt too safe. He wrote about his third-grade teacher, Miss Smith. He wrote about his twin brother, Leo. They sat at the same wooden desk because the school was crowded. It was a normal Tuesday morning. The sun was shining through the tall windows. He remembered smelling something strange that morning. It smelled like rotten eggs and old oil. He asked Leo if he smelled it too, but Leo just laughed and told him to focus on his math problems. My grandfather looked at the clock. It was 8:45 a.m. He noticed a man standing outside the school fence. It was Mr. Kehoe. Everyone knew Mr. Kehoe. He was the school board treasurer. He was a quiet man, a bit grumpy, but he helped fix the school's heater sometimes. He was just standing there, watching the windows. Mr. Kehoe wasn't waving. He wasn't moving at all. He just had this blank expression on his face. He looked like he was waiting for a bus that was never going to come. My grandfather felt a cold shiver go down his spine. Something about the way the man was standing felt wrong. Then, the world ended with just an explosion. There was no sound at first, just a sudden, violent upward jolt. My grandfather wrote that he felt like he was flying. Then everything went black. When he woke up, he couldn't see anything because of the thick, gray dust. It tasted like lime and copper. He tried to reach for Leo, but the desk was gone. The floor was gone. He was sitting on a pile of broken bricks and splintered wood. He looked down and saw his legs were covered in white powder. Then he started to crawl. He heard screams, but they didn't sound like children. They sounded like wounded animals. He found a gap in the debris and pushed himself through. He fell out onto the grass of the schoolyard. He was covered in blood, but it wasn't his. He looked back at the school. Half of the building was just flat. People from the town were already running toward the ruins. He saw his father's truck pulling up to the gate. He felt a surge of relief. Then he started running toward the fence. Then he saw Mr. Kehoe again. The man was sitting in his own truck, parked right near the entrance. He saw his father get out of the car and run toward the wreckage to find his sons. A crowd of parents and rescuers had gathered right by Mr. Kehoe's vehicle. Mr. Kehoe looked at my grandfather. For a split second, their eyes met. The man didn't look angry. He didn't look crazy. He just looked tired. He reached down and pulled a lever. The second explosion was louder than the first. It was filled with shrapnel. Bolts, nails, and pieces of farm machinery flew through the air. My grandfather was knocked to the ground again. When he looked up, the crowd of rescuers was gone. His father's truck was a twisted skeleton of metal. He lay there in the grass for a long time. He waited for Leo to come find him. He waited for his dad to pick him up, but nobody came. He eventually stood up and walked toward the road. He passed pieces of his classmates' clothing hanging from the trees. The ledger ended there, but there was a small note tucked into the back cover. It was a clipping from a local newspaper, dated a month after the blast. It said that Mr. Kehoe had been angry about a tax levy that was being used to pay for the school, so he felt the town had robbed him. Then he decided to take everything from them. I put the ledger back in a box and went downstairs. I looked at the old photos of my grandfather again. I realized why he never smiled in them. I realized why he spent 40 years sitting on that porch staring at the trees. He wasn't looking at nature. He was listening. He told my mother once that the hardest part wasn't the day it happened. It was the day after, and the year after that. The town didn't close down. People still walked the streets. They still went to the hardware store. But there was a silence that settled over the valley. For 10 years, there were no birthday parties. There were no kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. There were no voices yelling in the park at noon. An entire generation had been erased by a man who was upset about a bill. My grandfather lived the rest of his life in that silence. He died in it. And now, every time I sit in a quiet room, I feel that same heavy, hollow misery. I grew up in a nice neighborhood in Southern California. It was the kind of place with manicured lawns and kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on. My house was right next to the Miller family. The Millers were quiet, extremely quiet. They had a large, two-story house that always looked a bit darker than the rest. The blinds were always drawn tight. We knew they had a lot of kids. We would see them piled into a large van, sometimes late at night. Usually around 10 or 11 p.m. They all had the same pale skin and messy bowl-cut hair. My parents just thought they were deeply religious. Maybe they homeschooled and kept to themselves. In a neighborhood like ours, you don't really poke your nose into people's business. It's just not what you do. We even joked that they were like owls. I remember one summer afternoon when I was out front washing my car. It was a typical hot California day. The sun was blinding. I happened to look over at the Miller's side window on the second floor. The blinds moved, just a tiny bit. A pair of eyes looked out at me. They didn't look like a child's eyes. They looked old, but the person was so small. The person stayed there for a long time, just staring. They didn't wave or smile. They didn't even blink. After about 10 minutes, a hand reached up and pulled the person away from the glass. The hand didn't look like a mother's hand. It was forceful. The blind snapped shut. I felt a weird knot in my stomach. But then my phone buzzed, and I went back to my car. I figured they were just strict. A few months later, it was a Sunday morning. Around 6 a.m., the neighborhood was completely silent. I was up early to go for a run. As I tied my shoes on my porch, I heard a sound. It was a metallic scraping. It was coming from the side of the Miller house. I looked over the fence. One of the small windows was pushed open. A girl was crawling out. She was tiny. She looked about 10 years old, maybe younger. She was wearing a dirty nightgown that was way too big for her. She dropped to the grass. She didn't run. She just stood there for a second, blinking at the morning light like it was hurting her. Her skin was a translucent white. You could see the blue veins underneath. I walked toward the fence. "Hey," I whispered. "Are you okay?" I didn't want to wake her parents and get her in trouble. She turned her head slowly. Her face was sunken in. She looked terrified. She didn't say anything. She just pointed toward the house and started shaking. She reached out her hand toward me. That's when I saw it. Her wrist was raw and red. There were deep, purple bruises in the shape of circles around her arms. It looked like she had been tied up. "Help," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, like she hadn't used it in years. "Please." They're still in the dark. Before I could react, I heard a heavy thud from inside the house. A man's voice yelled something I couldn't understand. The girl's eyes went wide. She didn't wait. She scrambled over the back fence and disappeared into the alleyway. I stood there for a minute, paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. Should I knock? Or should I call the police? Then I decided to go back inside and grab my phone. When I looked out my window a few minutes later, Mr. Miller was standing in his driveway. He was just standing there, looking at my house. He wasn't doing anything. He was just watching. He had this blank, empty look on his face. I called the police. I told them a girl had run away and looked hurt. I told them about the bruises on her wrists. They arrived about 20 minutes later. I watched from my window as they knocked on the door. Mr. Miller opened it calmly. He looked like a normal, tired dad. He invited them in. I thought maybe I had overreacted. 10 minutes later, more sirens started coming. Then an ambulance. Then 3 more. The police officers who came out of the house looked pale. One of them sat on the curb and put his head in his hands. The news crews arrived by noon. That's when the truth started coming out. There weren't 10 kids. There were 13. And they weren't kids. Most of them were adults. The girl I saw was 21 years old. She had been shackled to a metal bed frame for months. Some of her siblings had been chained for years. They were living in their own filth in the dark. They were only allowed to eat once a day. They were only allowed to wash their hair once a year. The parents would buy toys and leave them in the packaging just to taunt them. They would cook food and leave it on the counter where the kids could smell it, but couldn't reach it. The most chilling part was the neighbors. We were all there. We saw the van. We heard the quiet. We lived our lives and mowed our lawns while people were being tortured 30 feet away. The Millers were arrested, obviously. They're never getting out. But the story didn't end with a celebration. The kids were moved to hospitals and then to different facilities. I saw a follow-up story on the news a few months ago. Most of them can't function. They don't know how to use a microwave. They don't even understand how money works. Some of them were placed into the foster system, and there are reports that they were neglected there too. They went from one prison to another. They survived, but they don't really have a life. I moved out of that neighborhood a year later. I couldn't look at that house anymore. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that girl. I think about how many times I sat in my room playing video games while she was screaming silently next door. The parents are in jail, but the damage is permanent. Those kids are still trapped in their own heads. Every time I see a house with the blinds drawn tight, I feel a cold pit in my stomach. I know that for some people, the light came far too late. Their lives are just a long, quiet stretch of misery.